But let's turn to another domain. So consider something nice and mild, not nuclear weapons, neoclassical markets. Markets in which isolated individuals seek only to maximize a particular form of self-interest, and certainly a form that's consciously constructed with very great effort, with perceptions instituted by vast industries that are devoted to implanting and reinforcing them. In the United States, about 1/6 of gross domestic product, that's well over $1 trillion a year, is devoted to marketing. Much of it is just manipulation and control, trying to institute these values, starting with infancy. Well, these constructed systems have a number of well-known problems. One is that unborn generations who are going to face the consequences have no vote in the market, from which it follows that their interests count as zero in the market system. They don't enter into consideration in a well-functioning market. That alone tends to undermine the possibilities of the sustainable development on which survival relies. These threats are currently being enhanced very consciously by dedicated efforts to weaken the institutional structures that might address these externalities, as they're called. And even more important, to undermine the culture of sympathy and solidarity that sustains them. Now, this last commitment, I think, is pretty important. I believe it's the driving force behind the propaganda efforts that are designed to undermine popular support for healthcare systems of the kind that are found in other industrial societies, and to create a largely artificial sense of crisis about the schools and Social Security, and in fact about any institutions that rely on the dangerous sentiment that we might care about somebody else, not just ourselves. The Social Security scam has other roots, and it's a scam. Take a look if you don't believe it. Whatever one thinks about transferring Social Security to stocks, to the stock market, there are two consequences which are absolutely clear and undebatable. One is that it's a huge bonanza for Wall Street. Another is that it entails that working people are going to end up with a tremendous stake in the value of stocks, the stocks on which their survival, post-retirement survival, depends on the survival of their families. That means that working people will have a strong reason to oppose decent wages and working conditions, health and safety standards in the workplace, the social and economic rights that are given formal endorsement in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but which the U.S. strongly opposes, and other principles that are naturally despised by the unaccountable private tyrannies that dominate the domestic and the international society in close alliance with one another and the powerful states that they largely dominate. That's another prescription for disaster, and not so in such a long term. Well, it's commonly claimed that there's a huge payoff for these problems, what's called globalization or the new economy or free markets or other terms of propaganda, I believe, referring to the social and economic policies of the past 20-odd years. According to the story, they have led to unprecedented economic growth, though unfortunately a few have been left behind and have to do something about that, all led by the spectacular fairy tale economy of the United States. You've read this 1,000 times. So take, say, the most critical voice in the New York Times, Anthony Lewis, on March 10th. He informed us that, I'm quoting, "The greatest economic boom in America's history, in fact in the world's history, came in the 1990s. What is Lewis referring to? He's referring to the fact that an unusually slow recovery from the recession of the early 90s was compensated by a growth spurt in the last few years that brought the growth rate for the 90s to about the level of the rather dismal 20 years that preceded it. All of that is well below the level of economic growth or productivity growth in the first, what many economists call the golden age of Western capitalism. That's from World War II up till the mid-1970s. It was in the mid-1970s that the Bretton Woods system of regulated capital was dismantled, and the new era of globalization and neoliberalism was instituted, bringing with it, uncontroversially, a substantial deterioration in macroeconomic indicators wherever the rules were followed, including the United States. Furthermore, even the relatively anemic growth in the United States through the 90s was unusual in that it left out most of the population. I don't know if this earlier period in U.S. history of which that's true. During the golden age, prior to neoliberalism, during the golden age, wages and benefit rose very rapidly across the board. Just to give you some figures, from 1947 to 1973, real wages rose 75%. From 1973 to 1998, they fell 9%, back to the level of 1967. Furthermore, it was level growth in the golden age. In fact, the lowest quintile had the highest growth rate, and the highest quintile had the lowest, and benefits and so on went along with it. During the globalization phase, the benefits of the much slower growth are very highly skewed. Even after the growth spurt of the late 90s, the male median wages are below 1989, peak of the last business cycle. For a large majority of the population, they're well below the 1970s. Family incomes have been more or less sustained, but that's by a far heavier workload. In fact, the heaviest in the industrial world by the early 1990s. Take Massachusetts. In Massachusetts, median income declined by, half above, half below, declined by about 10% in the 1990s. It was even steeper decline in Connecticut. In California, purchasing power per family dropped about $1,000 during the 1990s, according to a recent Federal Reserve Bank of California report. Notice that these are the stars of the new economy, real fancy places. Social indicators have been declining since the mid-1970s. Before that, they rose, kind of tracking gross domestic product. They've been declining since. They're now about the level of 40 years ago. The poverty levels, approximately like 20 years ago. It's the highest in the industrial world. Second is England, the other country that's more or less kept to the neoliberal rules. Furthermore, even this much less than impressive economic performance is very fragile. In fact, everybody knows that now. It's fueled mainly by consumer spending. The consumer spending is stimulated by fanatic propaganda efforts. One consequence of it is that it's led to unprecedented debt, household debt past disposable income last year for the first time in American history, and also a huge trade deficit. Now, the trade deficit is not much of a problem for policymakers. Two MIT Nobel laureates had an op-ed in the Times about that, retired economics professors yesterday, and they're right. It's not. They talked about the threat of the deficit. It's not much of a problem to policymakers, but they didn't point out that it's a major problem for the population. If you look at polls, it's been the most important economic issue for the population for some years. It doesn't enter into political campaigns at all, but that's for another reason. That's because this is an issue on which the business community has one view and the population has another view. And such issues cannot enter into the political arena in our democratic society because of the way it's structured. But if you look at polls, the trade deficit and capital mobility generally, people don't call it that, but that's what we're talking about, is the leading economic issue because people understand that it's a threat to job quality and job security, as indeed it is. These problems are worldwide. They're not just the U.S.